You are off by noon because you all have a lot to do. So with that, Edna, can you please start recording? And I'm going to go ahead and kick it over to Dustin and David for the first part of the agenda.
All right, well, welcome everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you here today. My name is Dustin Whedon, and I'm a senior policy analyst with the State Higher Education and Executive Officers Association. And along with my colleague David Tanberg, we are going to be facilitating today's discussion. And we know we have a packed agenda, so we definitely want to get to that. But before we dive into the agenda, we're going to provide a few context setting remarks, but we really do have a lot to accomplish today. And really a couple of goals for this meeting, it seems like, are to review the current funding formula, identify some opportunities for improvement, and let's develop some guiding principles to developing some goals and outcomes that will lead to an improved formula. So some of you may not be familiar with SHIO, so I'd like to start by introducing our organization to you all. We are a national association serving chief executives of statewide governing policy and coordinating boards of post-secondary education and their staffs. And our mission, in combination with our members, is to work to promote an environment that values higher education and its role in ensuring the equitable education of all Americans, regardless of race, ethnicity, gender, or socioeconomic factors. And to achieve our mission, we do accomplish several activities. We're an advocate for state policy leadership. We act as a liaison between states and the federal government. We provide information and analysis on education and public policy issues. And really one of our key concepts that we are guided by is that recognizing that state context matters. So with today's meeting focused on reviewing the current funding formula in New Mexico, we wanted to let you know that you're definitely in good company. And over the past few months, we've talked to at least 4 states who are currently going through some stage of review process of their funding model and funding formulas. And we really recognize this as a healthy step to keeping funding formulas current and recognizing that state funding practices, student behaviors, and institutions are constantly evolving. So the funding formula has to evolve and be reviewed on a regular basis as well. And based on a recent survey that we conducted with finance officers, most states responded that if they had a funding formula, they review it every 3 to 5 years. So I understand you're kind of maybe just getting past that stage. So it definitely sounds like it's a good time to take a look at your current model. So with that brief overview, I'm going to turn over to David.
Yeah, thanks so much. And I'm going to go ahead and try and share my screen. I'll admit I'm more of a Zoom person than a Teams, so we'll see if I can make this work.
And David, what's your role again?
What's my role again?
What's your position and what's your full?
Yeah, I'll do that.
You'll do that here in a bit.
Yes,
no,
he will.
This is not the right.
We can see it, David.
It's not the right content. There we are. Okay, is that it? Yeah, okay. From beginning. Okay, yeah, so thanks so much for allowing SHIO to join you today. My name is David Tanberg. I'm the Senior Vice President of Policy Research and Strategic Initiatives at the State Higher Education Executive Officers Association. I've been with SHIO for about 5 years. Before that, I was an associate professor and associate director of the Center for Post-Secondary Success at Florida State University, where I taught and conducted research for a little over 6 years. And before that, I actually worked in a SHIO agency in Pennsylvania, where we dealt with a lot of the issues that you all deal with in New Mexico, though in a different context. I'll make it clear that Secretary Rodriguez and her agency are a member of our association, which is why we are here with you all today. I'm going to skip over our introductory slides that we typically go over because Dustin provided these for you. So one question is, that we were asked to touch on is why conduct a funding formula review? And I'll tell you that this is one of the real hot topics. Every month we meet with finance officers from all of our member associations, from all 50 states, whoever chooses to participate. And a perennial topic is how to evaluate funding formula and why. In fact, a couple of the finance officers are working with SHIO to come up with a toolkit for how to conduct a funding formula review within their states. And when that's wrapped, we'll be sure to share it with you all. And one of the most important questions, kind of the starting point for conducting a review, is to try to answer the question of, is the current flow of state dollars advancing the state's goals and values? And of course, you have to be able to identify and have some agreement around what the state's goals and values are. But once you do that, it requires a careful evaluation of where the dollars go and the impact of those dollars. Also, why conduct one? Well, state funding practices, student behaviors, and institutional contexts are constantly evolving. We also know that decisions around state funding of higher education come with unintended consequences, both negative and positive. We also know that state context, economies, demographics, et cetera, are in flux and changing. 3 to 5 years seems to be, I don't know if it's a rule, but it seems to be a pattern as to how frequently states evaluate their funding formulas. When analyzing the dollars, it's important to understand who is benefiting the most and who isn't. Which students, institutions, geographies, programs, how do their fundings compare? We recommend a financial equity audit. It's important to determine how different demographics are benefiting from the way the state is currently allocating dollars. And that's important to consider by race, ethnicity of the students, income, locality of the institutions. These all have significant equity implications and can directly impact the ability of higher education to advance larger goals and to promote their larger values. New Mexico, of course, is unique in the majority-minority status, but yet there is still great diversity in the extent to which institutions serve students of color, and that matters, and the funding allocated matters. What are the larger state needs, priorities, and strategies that are bigger than higher education, but which higher education may impact, and how does the funding formula advance that? Of course, these things are incredibly complicated. Determining the extent to which an institution should be funded by the state and comparing their present funding to other institutions, it is not a one-to-one exercise. We know that upper division courses cost more. Research and graduate education is very expensive, yet is critical to the state. Providing intensive services, adequate services to students who've been minoritized and underserved, that costs money, but yet it's some of the most important work that we can do. Likewise, rural areas can be more expensive to serve, yet critical from a values perspective and from a state goals perspective, and therefore is critically important. And the list could go on. It's not, unfortunately, not a simple exercise. But the place to start is with the numbers and a careful assessment of how the dollars are flowing and to where. So outcomes-based funding, since the kind of mid-2000s, we've seen a real resurgence of outcomes-based funding, or what was previously referred to as performance-based funding. And I think you all as higher ed professionals know very well, it's basically funding on a number of measures that we would consider perhaps outcomes measures that the state and the institutions consider important. And at this point, the majority of states have some form of what we might call outcomes-based funding. There are some potential benefits that the research has identified. It provides a clear signal to the institutions and their leaders of what the state thinks is important. We found that within institutions, staff and leadership report a more clear focus on student outcomes. And a number of other things, and even some evidence of improved student support services. However, outcomes-based funding is something that brings with it inherent risks. We've seen in a number of studies in a number of states increased selectivity, particularly on the part of research universities. We've identified adverse effects on low-income, minoritized, and adult students. Increased institutional stratification within states, including in funding, that higher resourced institutions tend to do better, decrease institutional morale, and decrease cooperation. These things can be addressed, at least to a certain extent, by the design of the program. One of the biggest risks is potentially greater equity gaps by race, ethnicity, and by income. However, we have seen some evidence that having what we call equity metrics that are adequately funded can offset these negative effects, at least to a certain extent. Equity metrics would be something like a bonus for students of a particular race, ethnicity that has been underserved. So perhaps Native American students, Latino students, Black students. They can also be directed to low-income students, or if you have the data, first-generation students. So it would be a bonus or additional funding for the successful graduation of those students, and I would argue also the successful enrollment and graduation of those students. An equity audit can help you better understand the current trends in regards to funding for the institutions that predominantly serve these students or serve them to a greater extent, and also how these students are faring.
David, real fast, this is Stephanie Rodriguez. Just
Yeah.
for some context, minoritized is a new term for me. We don't necessarily use it in New Mexico. When you use minoritized, what does that mean?
It generally means students who have faced historic barriers and discrimination, and therefore, on the whole, tend to be, and I would be speaking nationally, not necessarily in New Mexico, underrepresented in higher education. We use the minoritized because it's less of a deficit approach to discussing things. It's not the student's fault, it's the structure, society's fault that they're underrepresented.
So may I ask, how do we know they've been discriminated against?
Well, again, I'm talking historically and nationally. I think the barriers that have been put up in front of the structural barriers that have been put up in front of Black students are pretty well recorded in our history, right? That I think if we think of the racism and even deliberate policy decisions have put up historic barriers, structural barriers. The same would go for Latino and Native American populations. And so it's just an acknowledgement that those things are real. And so that's why we use the term minoritized.
Okay, you might want to be careful with that. And then also the free college, is that just applied to community colleges, or is that to four-year schools as well?
Yeah, so these are current federal policy considerations. And right now, the Biden administration has proposed a free college / federal state partnership. It is focused primarily on what they're defining as community colleges. So these are two-year colleges predominantly. However, there is a portion that makes HBCUs and MSIs, so these would be like HSIs, available, possible for them to participate. And focused on the first 2 years of college. So,
and if I can, Mark, I know that that's been a topic that you and I have discussed, but SHIO, particularly President Anderson, and I have had conversations about how Opportunity Scholarship in New Mexico would be all encompassing. And that is our goal. And they do want to use that as an example to the Biden administration to eventually open that up to four-year institutions. However, Biden administration has been very adamant on the two-year component, but we're looking to use New Mexico as an example of someone that is more encompassing.
Thank you, Secretary. And David, the question I guess what I'm trying to get at is we're putting a lot of money in New Mexico towards free tuition for community colleges through our Opportunity Scholarship and then the lottery. So I'm wondering if the federal funding for free college is that changing the state funding for two-year schools? Because I would think that the state funding should go down for two-year schools and go up for four-year schools if the federal governments can put more money into two-year schools. I'm just wondering if you're seeing that nationally or that discussion is taking place.
There's so many discussions going on, and the funding is critical. And so, as a component of this, what the federal government is currently considering, and we don't know where they'll land, right? I mean, this legislation's evolving, is that they would do a comparison of a particular state. So let's say New Mexico, their tuition and fees relative to the national average. And then the New Mexico would provide a certain percentage of funding, and the federal government would bring a certain percentage of funding, say 75%, 25% for New Mexico, to bring it in line with the national average and essentially make it free, right? Okay. And we're very concerned because with that, there's also a maintenance of effort provision. So that's ensuring that the state continues a certain level of funding for both 2-year and 4-year. And so it could get really costly to states, like really, really expensive. And so what we're trying to work on with them is bring the state's contribution to a reasonable level, understanding that states must balance their budget. There are other priorities. They have other maintenance of effort requirements with other state programs. And many states have taxing and spending limitations that are constitutional or in legislation, and therefore states can only do so much. And that's and I won't go into a ton on this because it's not the purpose of today's conversation, but just that's part of the context that you all may likely be facing in the future. And so understanding the relationship between funding and affordability, and perhaps a ramp up in funding over the next several years that may be required by participation in this program may be something you want to consider. The other is the College Completion Fund. This is a much more clear-cut win for higher education, which would be, right now, the Biden administration is proposing $62 billion for state plans to implement evidence-based student success strategies. And so it would be an influx of money for you all to use to even better serve your students. And so it's pretty exciting. It would help complement a lot of the good work you all are already doing to help move students through college to graduation. So with that, I will try to stop sharing my screen if I can figure out how to. Yes. Secretary Rodriguez, should we take questions now or should we continue through the agenda?
What I would like to do actually, now that I do see all of our presidents on from the institutions, David, can we do a quick Q&A and then we can open it to questions related to the presentation?
So did you mean introductions and then questions or?
I would like to do introductions only because I don't think we all know each other, and I see my colleagues have questions and stuff, and I want to make sure you all know who they are and who they represent. Is that okay?
Perfect.
All right, so you all met David and Dustin. David is a vice president of SHIO, and Dustin is an analyst who will be helping us. With that, you guys know who I am. I'm Stephanie Rodriguez, and joining me today, I'm just going to say their names, are Dr. Harrison Rommel and Director Mark Chisholm. Cup, can you go ahead and introduce yourselves next?
Absolutely. Joe Shepard, President of Western New Mexico University.
And Mark Saavedra, the Director of the Council of University Presidents.
Thank you, Mark. New Mexico Independent Community Colleges.
Becky Rowley, President of Santa Fe Community College.
And Kathy Ulibari, Executive Director of the NMICC.
Thank you. The New Mexico Association of Community Colleges, which encompasses our branch campuses.
Good morning. I'm Sean Powell, President of Eastern New Mexico University here in Roswell and representing the ACC.
Good morning. Ty Trujillo, Director of the New Mexico Association of Community Colleges.
Thank you so much. I do see that we also have Secretary Romero. Go ahead, Secretary.
Good morning. Debbie Romero, Department of Finance and Administration. Nice to meet you all.
And David and Dustin, you did meet my colleague earlier, Mark Valenzuela. Mark, go ahead and say hi real fast.
Hello, glad to be here, Madam Secretary.
Mark is an observer. However, the member of the working group is LFC, which is Director Abby, who will be joining us a little later. So David, go ahead and go into questions now. I just wanted to make sure you had some context of who was on the call with us while questions were going on.
Thank you so much, Madam Secretary. Yeah, happy to receive any questions, and Dustin and I will do our best to answer them.
Yeah, David, and thank you for that presentation, and nice to meet you and Dustin. Thanks for being with us. Back to the maintenance of effort, I think that's interesting because I don't think we got considered that in terms of the first round of the CARES Act here in New Mexico, or just in higher ed. But when you talk about maintenance and effort by the state, does that include local funding or is that just state funding?
That is such an excellent question, and that's something that we've brought up with them. And both, so if we're focused on the federal-state partnership, we've raised the issue with them that even in the state match, they were only considering state, which would put states that have a local state split for institutional support in a really difficult position, right? Because the state would essentially have to fill the role of the state and the local government to bring it up to meet the match requirements, which just would not be fair to states that have had a tradition of local funding. So we push them on that. On the maintenance of effort right now, it's also only considering state, and we've raised that with them too. Frankly, there's a number of issues where the folks in DC just don't understand the diversity of approaches across the state. For example, the number of instances where a local four-year institution serves a local community college mission in their area, right, where they are open enrollment or nearly open enrollment, they offer certificates and associate's degrees because it would be too costly to locate another community college right next door to the four-year institution. That's actually quite common. Likewise, as the legislation is written right now, it would exclude many technical colleges that don't offer associate's degrees because the legislation is written towards two-year colleges. And yet there are many technical colleges that primarily provide certificates. So those are a few areas where we try to provide some state real talk to the federal government.
Okay, thank you, David. That was really helpful. Appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah.
David,
Hey,
I have a question. Could you maybe just touch briefly on how other states do a sort of equity audit in analyzing their student population?
That's really a great question, and it does get, as you could imagine, somewhat complicated. So I'll maybe hit on just a few high points, and then we're happy to circle back and provide any documentation that we have. And so it's really, the state has to, generally when we talk about financial equity audits, we talk about the flow of state money as it follows or hits students, right? And so one of the big questions that it starts out with is, are the institutions that are serving targeted or prioritized students that would be defined by the state getting adequate funding? So nationally, if we look nationally, the institutions that serve the majority of our Black, Latino, and Native American students are underfunded per FTE relative to the institutions that tend to serve predominantly white and upper income students, for example. And so a financial equity audit within New Mexico, you'd have to start with, well, what are the target populations we're most concerned with? And then it would be an assessment of state funding per FTE. This would be one effort. There'd be other things you'd have to do, but one critical component would be state funding per FTE for the institutions that tend to serve greater percentages of those students. Again, it's somewhat different in New Mexico because of the demographics, but there is variance there. You could also then complicate it with the level of program, et cetera, the missions of the institutions. You have to be careful to consider those things. But generally, is state funding advancing the success of targeted populations of students, or is it rewarding institutional privilege or whatnot?
Thank you.
Thank you for that question, Dr. Rommel. Do we have any other questions before we move on to the next part of the agenda and then our discussions?
Yes, ma'am, Secretary. I'm back to the maintenance of effort. David, do they separate public schools and higher ed when it comes to that maintenance and effort?
They tend to, yes, public higher ed is where they focus. And you know, I'll say that, you know, in some previous maintenance of efforts were what we would say were pretty weak, in that the ability to get a waiver was pretty easy, right? And there are certainly those organizations, mainly that are pushing pretty hard to make the one associated with the federal-state partnership a much more robust one, so harder to get out of, and tying it to previous years' funding that was higher, right? So kind of skipping the recessions and going to the more robust periods of state funding and tying it to those. And generally, I would say, you know, SHIO, we tend to be supportive of maintenance of efforts requirements because we like funding for public higher ed. we want to also thread that needle that we don't lose state participation by making it too rigorous, right? We don't want a state to opt out and then not be able to benefit from the completion fund or the federal state partnership, but at the same time, we want something there that ensures adequate funding going forward. So that's a bit of a tightrope to walk, I'll admit.
And the reason I did, and Madam Secretary, I'm asking that question is that, you know, we have such a heavy, I mean, in terms of funding in New Mexico, almost 50% of our funding goes to public education. And now we have the Martinez-Yazzie case, which, you know, adds additional funding to that. So I just wouldn't want us to be at a disadvantage, Madam Secretary, whether it's 2 years or 4 years when it comes to that maintenance effort, because that you know, would be somebody, you know, we would be at a disadvantage when it comes to our match, and then it would put a lot of stress on the legislature as well. So just wanted to put that, yeah. So thank you, David.
Yeah, and that's definitely a message we're carrying in Washington, and I've had a decent reception among Senate, House staff, the department, and the White House, and we'll keep pushing that.
Thank you. Appreciate that, David. Thank you very much.
Thank you for those questions, Mark. David, is it okay if I jump into the next part of the agenda?
Absolutely, Madam Secretary.
All right, thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. I know this meeting is overdue. However, thank you for your patience with myself and this agency as I'm getting my bearings. Aside from the conversation we had with the Higher Education Subcommittee, thank you to LFC for pulling us together monthly to have these tough conversations. I want to note that today is important because it's the first time that key stakeholders outside of that subcommittee and higher education professionals and experts have been in a room since I've been at the agency to really dive deep into the higher education funding formula in New Mexico. As I stated earlier today, joining me from the agency are 2 resident experts at our agency, and I'm grateful for them. That's Director Mark Chisholm and Dr. Rommel. Director Mark Chisholm was part of the initial funding formula, and Dr. Rommel is now the presider of the funding formula for our agency. And prior to fully jumping into my preliminary comments for today, I have to reiterate to each of you that the New Mexico Higher Education Department is committed working alongside you as partners to really develop this funding formula and have it be in a place that enhances student success measures while building upon the state's existing higher education system. Now, I have to say, I know you all are experts and you have been in this for many, many years. However, I do have to do my due diligence as a secretary in breaking down the formula a bit more before diving into the larger discussion today. So the Instruction in General Funding Formula, we all call it ING, is a model that is influenced by student-centered outcomes while considering individual sector missions and goals across New Mexico. I know sectors is something that we have been talking about and maybe come up in our discussion today. And since fiscal year 16, the funding formula has remained rather constant. There have been years when stop loss was utilized in the funding formula. The weights of some of the measures were adjusted a couple of times. And in the most recent year, I have to note the CARES Act swap from the special session in FY21 was restored. I'm grateful to my colleagues at SHIO for facilitating this discussion today. The organization has been bringing together higher education leaders and experts to discuss their state funding formulas over the past year. Both Dr. Rommel and myself have attended a few of these convenings over the past year. And I have to note that prior to the pandemic, that across the nation, we saw 30 states that were employing outcomes-based policies. 6 states had created but not yet implemented their policies, and 5 states were designing their outcome-based policies. Now, other states that have student outcome-based formulas, and I bring these up all the time, and so does Director Chisholm when I talk to him, include Tennessee, Indiana, Colorado, and Oregon, to name a few. We all hear them in the national context all the time. Now, let's briefly touch on our higher education formula. And I know a lot of you are experts and already know this, but I have to reiterate it. Our outcomes are based on 5 methodologies, 3 of which are awards and make up 65%. These awards include the total awards and STEM-H and at-risk awards. The other methodologies are tied to sector mission measures, and end of course student credit hours. A small technical thing that Director Chisholm and Dr. Rommel always tell me is related to the student credit hours. They're tied to the number of hours that students that were actually enrolled at the end of the semester, but not necessarily students who had passed those courses. So something to note. We also have 3 tiers that we take into account, and David briefly touched on this a little earlier in his presentation, but we start with lower division courses to our graduate courses. The 3 tiers were developed in order to reflect that certain award programs are more costly for institutions to offer than others. Tier 1 are humanities, business, and liberal arts. Tier 2 include our technical and general science programs, and Tier 3 are our engineering and health sciences programs. I also want to note that across the nation, there is a common consensus that monitoring the efficiency of a funding formula is absolutely necessary in reviewing its effectiveness and our collective intended vision over time. Our current funding formula is relatively young. It was established in 2016. However, many of the partners in this room today are committed to a dialogue to discuss adjustments and improvements as needed to the funding formula. And we all can attest, and I have all heard this from all of us in our side conversations, we need an equitable funding formula moving forward. Now, a few housekeeping items for today. Members of the working group, please have your cameras on as you can. And remember that you can adjust your screen to be in speaker view or gallery view. I personally prefer gallery view like the Brady Bunch. Another thing is members are also able and encouraged to utilize the chat throughout the conversation. Sometimes it is helpful for us in remembering some of our points so that we don't forget them. Observers, please feel free to take notes today. You can send your comments to Dr. Rommel and Director Chisholm, and they will put their emails in the chat for you all. If you would like to follow up on a comment, please raise your hand and my colleagues at SHIO or myself will be sure to help facilitate the discussion and get to your point. And as a reminder, the meeting is being recorded and will be posted for members of the public and your colleagues to view after this meeting. And additionally, Edna Quiñones from our agency will be taking meeting minutes of the conversation. With that, I am really eager to turn to the discussion. We will go through each stakeholder group today. I know many of us have written reports and memos and sent it to one another, and we have viewed those. But a dialogue is critical for the evaluation and response across sectors and state entities where we can actually have an honest conversation about what is happening that is right, what are challenges. So like I said, let's touch on the following today in our conversation. 1, what is working? 2, what are some of the challenges that we're seeing in your sector and across other sectors? And 3, do you have solutions? Now that's a little harder. And if we're not there yet, that's okay. We eventually will be with this working group. And once more, I'm grateful to SHIO and their assistance in helping me facilitate this discussion today. They have done so much this past year. They have worked with our agency, and they're really going to help us dive a little deeper into this conversation. So with that, David, would you like me to just call on the associations and groups and we can get started on that discussion and dialogue?
I think that would be perfect.
All right, fantastic. And like I said, this is a discussion, this is a conversation, this is a dialogue. Even though an association or a state entity may be talking about some of those points I mentioned, the 3, feel free to raise your hand and contribute to that point, ask questions of clarification, because we need to have these hard conversations now in this format versus in memos and reports at this point. And then we'll go ahead and develop a report for you all on what we discussed. So with that, I would like to actually start with the New Mexico Council of University Presidents. And we have Dr. Shepard from Western New Mexico University and Director Mark Saavedra on the call who can go ahead and start us out. And like I said, remember, conversation. If you need points of clarification, need to ask questions, please do so, raise your hand.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. I appreciate that opportunity to address this group. And to your point, this is a work in progress in terms of what we're going to accomplish. I made sure that I had a white wall behind me so you would not know where I was at. My hostage situation might be occurring. I don't know. I'll hold up a proof of life picture shortly. Normally I have a much better look behind me, David, just to let you know. But let's talk about the Council of University Presidents. And for David, for your sake, it involves 4 comprehensive universities and 3 research institutions. And that creates a challenge. But let me tell you what is working from my point of view. All 3 associations, I think you'll find today, have an eye on the totality of higher education. While you might not accept that that's part of the funding formula, in my mind, it's critical to the funding formula. Because one of the things that we've recognized is we're not competitors against each other. We're collaborators with each other because we want to advance higher education in New Mexico. So with that, one of the things to discuss goes back to an original point that you made in your presentation earlier that I think is crucial to moving forward. And that is, what are the values of New Mexico when it comes to higher education? What are we trying to accomplish? And where do we see ourselves 5, 10 years from now? Because this formula, once implemented, that's its timeline. It's not going to be tomorrow that you're going to see the cause and effect. And in my sector, when you have comprehensive, and when I say comprehensive, we have everything from adult education. For example, my institution does adult education, as does Northern. We also do some VOTEC programs. We have a community college bent to us. And then you have Eastern, for example, which is a comprehensive university that offers master's degrees, as does mine. But they have a branch campus. And so you have that thrown in. You'll hear from the branch campuses a little bit later on. You have Highlands that doesn't have a branch campus, but has other attributes. You have open access, you have limited access. And so we have a diversity even amongst the 7, and we haven't even gotten into the other 15 community colleges yet. So we had a retreat here recently at the College of University Presidents at the CUP retreat. And there's a couple of things that I want to share that speak to this difference. First of all, I want to talk about research. Oftentimes we as a collective body talk about workforce development. And we think of workforce development, and indeed it's important to get people out in the workforce and have the funding formula move us in that direction. And we think of that in terms of certificates. We think of that, but typically we think of that in terms of for credit. But we have a lot of non-credit activity at our community colleges. I'll let them speak to that. But we think about it in different ways. And if you're a research institution, you're thinking about it in ways primarily of quality graduate programs. Think of your Florida State days, quality graduate programs, and research that leads toward economic development, that leads toward innovation, that has a longer timeline of seeing the cause and effects than generating a boot camp certificate in computer programming. And so we have to say, I think the question of what do we want as a state needs to be broken down into the sectors. What should we be doing as a state in terms of research and enhancing that? How do we measure that? How do we move that forward in terms of entrepreneurship, patents, in terms of all those measurements? And how do we move that forward in terms of the funding mechanism? And for my colleagues here, they're probably tired of me saying it, but some of my colleagues here have not heard me say this because they were not part of the CUP presentation. But David, you'll remember about 12 years ago, I, by the way, came from a Florida university. It was Florida Gulf Coast University. And 12 years ago, University of Florida, and then of course, FSU, Florida State University, went to the legislature and they said, research has to be treated differently. And we want you to fund us differently than the other universities in the Florida system. And they made a deal with the legislature, and ultimately, as you'll recall, University of Central Florida and University of South Florida joined that research group, and the legislature set aside some funds specifically to move the prominence of FSU and UF, and then ultimately the other 2 universities forward. And they did it through their funding formula on that. And it was separate, and it was somewhat outside the formula, if you will. Meanwhile, I was down at a comprehensive, and I jealously looked at all the money going toward those institutions. But what happened was 10 years later, a decade later, University of Florida moved into the top 50, which was one of their goals, top 10 in terms of public universities. FSU moved into the top, they're now what, 56, 58th. From before they're in the top 100, somewhere in 130 something, they're now 56, 58. So it had a dynamic effect on what happened. And what happened with comprehensives, i.e. our institutions, was our value also raised. We didn't see it happening at the time, but as the flagship institutions went, we came along as well, and our institution benefited from those funding formula decisions. So as we look at this funding formula, I think it would be wise for us to say, you know, in the various sectors, what are we trying to accomplish on the research side, and how does that move the needle in terms of New Mexico? On the comprehensive sector, I've always felt comprehensive should be strong at the undergraduate. So the research are strong at the graduate with select undergraduate. Comprehensives are strong at the undergraduate with select graduate. And it's that combination of understanding. And then, of course, several of our institutions, mine included, do have that community college mix to it in terms of enhancing the workforce. In my case, I'm down in a district that does a lot of mining, and so we deal with welding and we deal with those sorts of pieces. How do we capture that in the formula? And then finally, New Mexico is an impoverished state. And what I mean by that is we're in the top 5 of that. Our population in comparators is not Arizona, is not Colorado, is not Texas. We have a very poor state, and a very large state at that. 60–70% of my students are first generation students. That is not typically your 28–32 SAT or ACT kind of student. They don't know what an FAFSA means, or financial aid means, or scholarship means. And so there's a lot more intensity from my institution to reach out and create that wraparound experience, create those advisors, a lot more labor intensive, and I'd say my colleagues would probably echo some of the same. And even at the research institutions, it's not the same type of student as you'd get at Florida State University or University of Michigan or University of Texas. It's a more challenging student. Secondly, we serve a large adult population. Over 50% of my students are above the age of 24, and I would submit to you that many of my colleague institutions is the same. So at risk, I think, and the formula needs to be differently defined. Right now, it's defined as Pell eligible. Well, we need to capture other data. Are you a first generation student? Because that's going to take more resources. Are you a working adult? Are you above the age of 24? That's going to take a different kind of resource. You know, you're 32-year-old, you don't want to go take it. You don't even understand what the AccuPlacer is, let alone the math that you're testing for was 15, 20 years ago, right? And so these pieces somehow need to be, if we want to change what's happening, need to be taken into account in terms of the funding formula. You asked for solutions. I think that's a longer conversation in terms of the solutions and how they go. But I do believe that how we measure things matter. Both that we do measure things and we hold each other accountable, but what we measure matters. So if we measure, for example, retention rates, well, that's first time in college freshmen who are taking 12 credit hours or more. That's about 10–15% of my population. We just lost the other 85%. And so I think it matters about persistency rates, because if I'm a working mother or father or whatever I am, I might only take 3 credit hours, 6 credit hours, but 10, 12, 14 years from now, I get a degree and I change my family dynamics forever. And I know that some of us have gone through that process. So I think we do need to have a conversation about what are the measurements and how do we measure and what do they mean, because they're not all the same for each institution. I'll give you another classic case. At our research institutions, their lottery dollars are what we call the lottery, and that's for the merit-based portion. About 75%. Meanwhile, at my university, it's about 25%, completely reversed in terms of the lottery dollars. Meanwhile, the Opportunity Scholarship, which, by the way, I'm a big fan of, because it's taking a look at that gap. It's taking a look at my other 75% and saying, what can we do to make sure we make a difference there? How does that fit in? And so this funding formula, in my mind, really needs to focus on that first part of my conversation, and that is per sector. What are the values? What is it of that sector that's going to contribute? Because I can tell you this, high-end jobs contribute to the economy. It just takes us longer to get the education to those high-end jobs. But if we only focus on the workforce piece as we define it, and we don't understand the 4 to 8 years piece window out there, 8 to 10 years from now, we'll be kicking ourselves for not doing that. So that's my quick piece, Stephanie. I know I took a little longer than I should have, but I just wanted to lay that out there as a foundation and now turn it over to my colleague, Mark Saveda, to make some comments.
Thank you, President Shepard, and appreciate the colleague. President Shepard is the chair of the council, and he's our senior president for our 4-year institutions in New Mexico. So in terms of has a lot of history and a lot of knowledge when it comes to higher education outside the state and in the state. So thank you, President Shepard. David and Dustin, again, thank you both. And like I said, I'm a big supporter of SHIO as well. And so I appreciate you all, working with us. And Madam Secretary, thank you for I think you touched on what, you think the overall goal to agree is, but I think it is important for all of our institutions to really at least sooner than later, or at least try to establish what are the main goals for this, right? In terms of, that we're not just doing this because it's something that we think needs to happen every so many years. I think, you always need to review the formula, but I'll just be really specific on specific questions is, in terms of, we want to establish what, eventually what are the proposed changes to the funding formula, and if there's nothing going to happen in recent months or up to this next session, that's fine. And then, major overarching goals. And then, David, Dustin, I think something we struggle in this, and I think our secretary is doing a really good job, and I think, and I want to give credit to our LC analyst who's online, Mark Valenzuela, is, can you maybe try to help us eventually major data set goals in other states that have helped to, change or, improve or in terms of funding formulas, because I think that's where we struggle here is we're definitely trying to get, and the secretary putting together a data set group led by Mark Chisholm. But I think data is a big deal in terms of maybe helping us what other states are doing. And then also, we are faced here with a decreasing enrollment situation that's reminded by, it's a big issue, right? Madam Secretary, you're going to put together a meeting in September to talk about enrollment and transfers. But my question is enrollment versus completion. We went from an old formula that really stressed on student enrollment and it supported student enrollment. And then when we changed to this new formula, we went into a completion focused formula. And of course, there's other reasons why our enrollment has been going down, but we also had, the recession, which really high in enrollment. And then of course, after that, you start seeing a decrease. So it's something I think we just need to keep in mind is that. And then of course, legislation, David and Dustin, is we've seen, for example, we've added a gap year to New Mexico. We've added requirements in the formula for 15 credit hours at a 4-year, 12 at a 2-year, that we think somewhat is added stress to certain types of students. And as President Shepard mentioned, we do have most of our institutions are a population of 24-year-old and up in terms of, and so you're seeing a lot of single parents or working students. And so I think, and so keeping those things in mind in New Mexico. So those are some of the questions. I think those are things that we just want to keep in mind. So that's basically what and I want to also just raise my hand in terms of, Madam Secretary, thank you for pointing out that we were going to get to the stage. So of course, I'm going to give myself a hard time that I jumped the gun and started asking a bunch of questions before we even got to this point. So thank you so much. Anyway, that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Mark, your comments are always appreciated, so please do not apologize. And David, I'm going to let you touch on that question in a second, but I just kind of want to wrap this up before we go to the next group of what you said. So a couple things that I heard that I just want to capitalize on. So visiting the various sectors and what are we trying to accomplish at the research side versus the comprehensive side versus the 2-year side and the branches and so on and so forth. I do agree that's something we've all put in our memos collectively that we need to reevaluate. At risk needs to be differently defined. And something that we need to consider is what types of data points do we need to start collecting in our IR shops and as an agency to figure out how do we develop at risk in our state, but how do we collect the data to support that definition? So first generation college student, things like that. So I agree with that point as well. And then something I want to touch on is we always talk about workforce, but we don't understand that there are multiple factors that contribute to our overall economy, and research is part of one of those things. So thank you for bringing that up and using the Florida example, President Shepard. And then Mark, your question was, what are some major data set goals in other states for funding formulas? So David, I'll turn it over to you to answer that.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, excuse me, I've got dogs barking in the background if you hear that. And I would, the question of data is a key one, right? I mean, we need the data to be able to answer these critical questions. And one resource that SHIO has is something we call the Strong Foundations Project or survey. And what we've done is gone through all 50 states, their student level data systems, what data they collect, and then what data we recommend they collect. And we tie these to answering certain critical questions. And so that's something I'll share with the secretary so that she can distribute it out. But I mean, some of the questions are more easily, perhaps more easily answered. Nothing's easy, we all know that. But so you don't want your data to drive your definitions. You want to start with your definitions. And so if you want to better define from the perspective of the state of New Mexico what an at-risk student is, you should start with that definition. How do we want to define it? Then go to the data, right? And if it means collecting new data, hopefully you can do that. If it means pulling in data from sources outside of state data systems, for example, the census and others, or IPEDs, you do that. Hopefully you have it already in your state data systems, but you definitely don't want to go to your data and say, let that drive your values, right, and your goals. Set your values and goals, and then find the data you need to be able to answer the questions related to those that you need to answer. And we can be as helpful as possible with that, because there are, we can get a little creative if need be, but I really want you to first decide what your values and goals are, and then we can move into the data questions.
I think that was really helpful. Thank you, David. Thank you, Madam Secretary.
Thank you, David. And then Mark, also just a reminder in our agenda, we will establish principles and goals before we end the conversation today so we can structure our next meeting accordingly. So with that, I would like to jump over to the New Mexico Association of Community Colleges. So Ty Trujillo, the Executive Director, is up, and President Powell of Eastern New Mexico University at Roswell.
I'm going to go ahead and throw it to Dr. Powell first. I always like to have my boss go first.
Sure. Thank you again for the opportunity to participate today. We appreciate the collaboration with NMICC and with CUP. I echo Dr. Shepard's ideas about advancing higher education. And I think one of the things for community colleges, and I'm preaching to the choir, is to meet student and community needs. We also have the local workforce development pieces. In terms of funding formula specific comments, I think one of the things we have to look at is the number and type of certificates and degrees that are being awarded and how those are being given out, and the number of hours they take or the amount of time they take and what the outcome of those certificates are. I think also course enrollment versus completion is something to look at. I think establishing funding levels for different types of classes is important because there's different costs for different types of classes. For example, a lecture class costs less than a lab class, which costs less than a clinical class. And we need to account for the differences in cost for those various types of classes, especially in the career technical education sides of the house. We need to understand also that students enroll in community colleges, whether they're branch campuses or independent colleges, for many different reasons compared to the students that typically enroll in traditional four-year universities. Many students don't enroll to complete a degree or certificate. Many of them may enroll to complete a general education requirement or to complete a specific class. I think we also have to account for dual credit. We have to account for the possible discrimination that can occur in our current situation where the tuition is free for these students, but the course fees are not. And many of these students are first generation students. They come from, in Roswell, they come from low income families a lot of the time. And we have difficulty having them pay course fees, especially for those courses that have consumables or combustibles that they have to buy. When we talk about funding the colleges and universities, we have to look at, the increase in enrollment and the cost to offer those dual credit classes. For example, in a welding class, all students use a similar level of consumables, the welding rods, to learn how to weld, regardless of whether they're a dual credit or a traditional student. Also, I think another point about this funding formula, and I know, Madam Secretary, you may get tired of me beating this drum, and I apologize, but I just strictly think that data reporting should be through the Higher Education Department for all state agencies. Right now, what's happening, and for the SHEO representatives, just so you know, when a request comes for data, that goes out to all the colleges from various state agencies. And the state agencies will have different requests, and then that information can be used to make legislative decisions. From my perspective, that can produce differences in what's being reported because all the data can be pulled from the different IR departments across the state, from the different colleges and universities, depending on their own methodology and what data formats they're using. All the data is reported to HED. It would be best to have one IR department that we pay for at the state level to form those reports that are then used to make the high stakes legislative decisions. And I know there has been work to develop a common set of data definitions. Again, I just think it would be better to have one IR department that develops all the reports, and if a state agency wants it, then they go to the Higher Education Department. So thank you for the opportunity to comment, and I'll turn the floor over to Ty.
Good morning, everyone. Ty Trujillo. Hope everyone's well. I'd like to pretty much echo what everyone's saying. I've had the opportunity to be here through not only the last funding go around for the funding formula, but the one before that as well. And just a couple of quick notes as far as some of the things specifically that I think that we need to address, and it's kind of what Dr. Shepard was saying. Where do we want to go as far as higher education, and specifically where do we want to go for me with the branch community colleges and community colleges sector in general? Specifically with this current funding formula, we all can agree that the redistribution is broken. We really need to get away from. I think that the core of the funding formula that we currently have is working. I think that there's some components within it that we need to look at and we need to address, and hopefully, I don't have the solutions right now, but hopefully we can get there with all of us. But obviously the redistribution, when we're having NMSU grants competing for money against the University of New Mexico or Highlands or whatever, it wasn't making it wasn't making sense. And so possible opportunities for us, I know that we've been discussing having us talk about comparing ourselves to our prior year performance and those types of things, and I think those are opportunities that we need to look at. I think that for branches, one of our main missions, since we're affiliated with the universities, is transfer. I think we need to have a real transfer measure within the funding formula that really looks at, and I know that a lot of the other community colleges will agree with me on this with the independents, is that transfer needs to be in there. I think that there needs to be a rule, because New Mexico is such a rural state, a rural recognition of serving those specific communities and what's going on within there. Maybe there's a rule / and also a workforce recognition, something within there regarding workforce. Those are the types of things that I'm hoping that we can touch within this funding formula. Like I said, I think we do have the core of the funding formula is good. I think that it's a good starting point, and I think with some work that we can around the fringes as far as, like I said, the redistribution, the transfer. And I agree with Dr. Shepard as far as some things in the recognition with research for universities and other types of things that we can really build on this thing. And so, that's why we're here. That's why I'm here, and I look forward to working with everyone.
Thank you so much, Ty. Thank you, President Powell. So just kind of some highlights that I gathered from my notes here. You guys brought up the number and types of certificates and degrees that are coming out of the institution. I think that's been something that we all three collectively as associations have been talking about, and I'm glad that it's on the table for us to discuss moving forward and how we do that. Another thing is establishing funding levels. So we do have our tier system. President Powell, something that has been coming up time and time again from the community college level is how do we accommodate for the price of CTE courses and even at times those professors? Because what happens is you lose a lot of professors to the actual trade and they're not coming to your school to teach because they don't make as much, right? But I know that's a separate conversation for another day, but I do agree we need to talk about CTE in particular. Discrimination so this is something you brought up that I maybe need to dive into, but it's dual credit. So you're right, you do waive tuition, and then a part of that funding is delivered to the public education department in the form of $1.5 million, but it's dispersed to the districts who then have to use it to spend on materials and instruction, other instruction needs, but not necessarily the fees associated with your institution. So that's something I need to talk to the public education department about in the executive is how do we adequately fund dual credit? Because an estimate out of our agency is it's 15 million. But all you guys get between the 1.5 that goes to the districts and then what we give you in the ING, significantly lower, and I recognize that. And then the last thing I'll just touch on, transfer. Ty, I'm glad you brought up transfer because you're right. Branches should be striving to transfer students if they're not complete with their career path or their education path. So we really do need to harness how branch campuses are working on transfer. I'm hoping our advisement transfer survey will be a component of that, and I'm looking forward to the meeting next month that we'll have to really dive into these issues. With that, David, Dustin, do you have any comments? I talk a lot in case you haven't noticed. All right. So I want to go ahead and go to the New Mexico Independent Community Colleges. From there, we have President Becky Rowley of Santa Fe Community College. However, she's no stranger to community colleges. She also was at Clovis Community College a while back as well. And then we have Kathy Ulibarri, who is the executive director, also not a stranger. She actually used to work at HED. So a lot of the things that I look at from 2000, I want to say 8, Kathy, maybe. Some of those were things that Kathy developed and wrote. So go ahead, you two.
Becky, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Kathy. I just have a couple of things to add, and then I think Kathy may have ideas about solutions, which is great. First of all, I just want to say that it's really nice to have a meeting like this where I can go third and agree with everything that my colleagues have said before me. That didn't always used to happen, but I think all of the points that, including the comments that Joe made about research are all really critical to making sure that the way that we go forward with our funding formula is really something that's workable and that really does take into consideration the larger picture of the role of higher education in economic development in New Mexico. And the comments about dual credit, certificates, all of those things are things that we have all worked on. One thing that I would mention too with the tiers, the tier 1, 2 tier, and I know that we've talked about reevaluating those. I don't know when those were last calibrated, but it was a very long time ago, I believe. And one of the things in addition to CTE that I think has always been a challenge is nursing, in that really the community colleges often fund what's really the guts of a nursing program. And we have challenges with, paying faculty enough, and our portion of that probably needs to be reexamined. But the one thing that I have found over time to be a challenge with the formula and I don't know how to fix it. People like Kathy know how to fix it, I think. It is the way that, so it was set up to essentially be performance-based in the NMICC group, and really in the community college sector. We have such a variety of size in our institution. So CNM is the largest college by enrollment in the state. And then we also have the tiniest colleges, two-year schools in the state. And so we're all really competing for the same money. The pie is divided up between all of us. And so what can happen, and what happens pretty consistently, is that there are a few smaller colleges who can actually improve some of their metrics than they.
Students aren't price sensitive. Everything's leading to like when lottery.
And they will still lose funding. And they will lose funding if the larger colleges that are in the sector gain more funding. So there's sort of a zero-sum game in that. And I think some of that has to do with the way the bases are figured and things like that. So it's a lot more complicated than I'm making it sound, but it is an issue. So there are a handful of colleges that will almost always lose on the funding formula, the way that it's crafted. And so we do things like hold them harmless, or not run the redistribution, things like that. And so as we go forward, I think it's really important to take a look at the way that we are counting awards and the way that we are counting those increases, so that if you do increase your performance, you will at the very least not lose any money. But you would, because I think people thought at the beginning that going forward, that if you improve on your own metrics, that you would gain money. And so we've talked about possible solutions where instead of grants competing with CNM, that we're all competing. We have our own metrics where Santa Fe Community College would look at its own history and its own performance metrics over the last several years and create meaningful benchmarks going forward, where we would try to improve relative to our own past performance, instead of trying to look at other people that we will never be able to really realistically compete with. So and I know those conversations are in the works. So I will turn it over to Kathy now and let her comment. She has probably about the best experience in the room in working with New Mexico's funding formula. So I take a lot of my my ideas from her. So go ahead, Kathy.
Thank you so much, Becky. And let me start by thanking Secretary Rodriguez and the HED for making this opportunity available for us. We're really glad to be able to have conversation about the funding formula, and I really appreciate David and Dustin agreeing to work with our state as we pursue this important endeavor. I'll start with just something brief about what I see as working. At the time we developed our current funding formula, the outcomes-based formula that is heavily weighted towards the production of awards, degrees, and certificates, we had in mind the common statewide goal or value of raising educational attainment levels. There was a lot of debate at that time about whether we should look at improved graduation rates versus just improved number of awards. We opted for the number of awards as the potential for moving us towards an improved educational attainment rate statewide more quickly than increased graduation rates. But of course, there's been a whole set of unintended consequences that come with that decision. Nonetheless, even though a relatively small portion of our state appropriation goes through the outcomes-based portion of the formula, it has worked. And as you cited in your presentation at the start of this, it took relatively little to get institutions on board and moving with the goal of increasing the number of awards. And we've seen them increase rather significantly since the formula was developed. So that part was good. Like others have said, we do have our challenges. This whole redistribution of the base concept is counterproductive. It is very disheartening for an institution when they improve performance and yet they lose money because another institution has improved more. And from what I've heard from my colleagues in the other associations, as well as a variety of state policymakers, I think we've got some good consensus there, and that might be a short-term issue to address relatively quickly if we could just eliminate that concept of redistribution. That then begs the question of, what do you replace it with? How do you distribute the funds? And I wouldn't say I have solutions, but I have some ideas of things I'd like to look at. Ty mentioned, comparing performance to prior year's performance, and absolutely, I think we should be looking at that to see how an individual institution is gaining. But I also think we ought to take a look at the concept of setting some reasonable targets by sector, by institution mission. And those targets could be institution specific, they could be sector specific, they could include some goals for the state overall. And what I mean by that is let's look at them not just in the way we set targets now for what we call the Accountability in Government Act performance measures, but really in the context of states that are similar to us socioeconomically, demographically, in the way that Dr. Shepard described earlier. We should also be looking in the context, targets in the context of benchmarks that are national averages. And perhaps we should set some aspirational targets as well, or at least, have in mind the context of what those benchmarks are, because we don't do that now. And I think sometimes if you haven't been in higher education for a long time, to say you've got a 26% graduation rate at a community college sounds pretty horrible. But in the context of a national average, it looks very different. So we need to have some of those conversations. Becky raised the issue of the base matrix, the tiers going forward. Definitely, I think we'll want to take a look at that. And the only other thing I'll add at this point is that assuming we stick with a statewide goal or objective of increasing the educational attainment rates overall, I think a lot of the NMICC institutions would like to take a look at some strategies like embedding in the formula ways to incentivize collaboration through things like reverse transfer. If a reverse transfer degree is awarded to a student, could the funding be split or prorated between all of the institutions that have contributed to the success of that student as a means to build collaboration through the process? So I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
So before I make comments on your comments, I do see Mark has his hand up, so I want to make sure if he has a question or point of clarification, he can go ahead and do that. So Mark Savager, go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. And this is probably just Kathy and Ty and President Raleigh and President Shepard and John from the ENMU just helping me to develop some ideas. So thank all of you, because I really do appreciate all your comments and suggestions. One thing I want to suggest, Madam Secretary, is something that I just want to point out. There's two other people that I think you'll work with outside of this that were part of the formula. And of course, we know Kathy's been with us a lot, Commission on Higher Ed, and then of course Ty's longevity as well with both NMICC and NMHED. And actually, when it comes to higher ed, I'm probably the younger one when it comes to being part of this whole group. But we have also Max Baca and Ricardo Rell. I think some people you might want to tap into in terms of their history and their expertise. But Ricardo has developed a discussion draft that he has shared with the HED. I shared with you, Madam Secretary, along with the other associations, that what I'm hearing from Ty and Kathy specifically is, you'll see probably in this discussion draft, we're all probably pretty much on the same page, I think, when it comes to what we want to do in terms of these suggestions. So that might also help and save some time by looking at that and sharing with everybody. I also think Mark Valenzuela, out of all the LC analysts that I've worked with, I think has really dived deep into this compared to a lot of other folks. And so I think his input and it will be very valuable. I just wanted to point out a few things I think to consider in terms of suggestions, but the public ed funding formula, in terms of how they fund on headcount versus in terms of on courses. So that's something we probably need to look at in terms of that. Somewhat in the state, how higher ed is somewhat funded compared to public schools. But what we're seeing is these kids are now coming to us, and we have this at-risk population that we're identifying in public schools. And I'd like to be able to see if there's a way data can track those kids once they come into our institutions. We think of remediation, we think of those kids on the FAFSA, but there's so many other things, right? And we've all discussed that. I think the other thing to just consider is transfer. If we can get from the SHIO folks, David and Dustin, is are there data out there that in terms of how other states are tracking transfer students, right? So that's the other thing. And then of course our age group of students, and of course generations in terms of are so different now that we're dealing with now with COVID. I think that's the other thing, is keeping that in mind in terms of what other states are doing, or how we're tracking, or in terms of how institutions nationally are changing because of whether it's the change in generation because of COVID. And then I just want to stress again in terms of enrollment, I don't want it to be a big driver of the funding formula, because enrollment it changes here. I mean, I think the LFC just presented in terms of, I read an article where we're going to do redistricting this year for the legislature. And I think we saw the largest growth in the state, or one of the largest growths in the state, was in the oil area, which was in the southeast part of the state. You see a huge population growth there. Now, what happens if oil and changes? What happens to that population growth? Same thing in higher education. When we see changes, whether it's a pandemic where enrollment goes down, whether it was the Great Recession, we saw enrollment go up. So kind of keeping those peaks and valleys in mind. And I really appreciate Director Abby, because he gave a really good presentation at our retreat that showed these peaks and valleys. And I think the legislature, and along with the executives, doing a tremendous job of trying, I think these days, keeping track of that. So anyway, just something to keep in mind. So thank you, Madam Secretary.
Thank you, Mark. And just before I comment on Kathy and President Rowley's comments, I'm going to jump over to President Shepard.
Thank you. As I listen to the various comments, I think we are all on the same page. There's one additional piece. This goes back to David, your point about data and having your values before you go looking for your data, but it also goes back to data collection. Some of us are moving into the realm of no longer a semester-driven data process. I know I now have students who are starting in October in our social work program. There's about 70 of them. I hope to someday have admissions entering every month, graduation every month, similar to some of the other colleges and universities across the country. So data is no longer a census date or an end of term date. And I just want to keep that in mind, that as we look at how we collect things, that it might not be the traditional or the legacy way that we have done so in the past. That's my only comment there. Thank you.
Thank you, President Shepard. So real fast, I just want to jump into NMICC and the comments that they had brought up. They did agree with the research component that was presented by CUP, so thank you for that. But they also echoed the CTE component, because it is really expensive to deliver those types of courses. Something we notice in the independent community colleges sphere is the variety of size is so diverse compared to our two other associations, because you have very, very small enrollment numbers, such as at Mesa Linds and Luna Community College versus CNM. So that was brought up, and we do agree with that. And that's why we're talking about equity in our formula, right? Challenges. So redistribution of the base that was mentioned in NMACC, NMICC brought it up, and it's definitely something that we've brought up in our reporting as well and in our memos that we would like to explore a little bit more as well. I do want to dive into some of the other comments that were made by my other colleagues. So Mark, you talked about looking at some of the work that Ricardo has done and presented to many of us. I want to remind folks we do have a technical group that is working on the side. So this is the policy-oriented group, and then we have a technical group that will put numbers into action to see if they actually work. And, you know, I think it's a great opportunity for Ricardo, me, and the technicians to sit down. And how do we feel about potentially bringing that forward for a discussion at our next meeting as a baseline, and then diving into some of the other goals and priorities that we saw? Is there anybody who would be against that, who would agree with that? You guys can text me or email me if we don't want to say it in this group or put it in the side, but we could potentially bring that up in our next conversation and start from there. I do see Ty.
I just have a quick question. So is that technical group currently meeting? Has it met yet?
It has not met yet.
Okay.
We wanted to start this meeting first.
Okay. All right.
And the only members of that technical group are Mark and Harry right now. So don't worry, we'll develop that a little more.
Okay.
Mark, go ahead.
No, I think that's a good plan. I do appreciate that you're right. There is a technical group. I just want to just emphasize that I think Ty and Kathy, President Shepard, and I'm not sure about the other two presidents because of, you know, but the formula really, the major changes to the formula were really around 12 and 13. We did make some adjustments in 15 or 16, but and there is an LLC evaluation that Shio might appreciate that was done, I think, in 2010 by Charles Soleil and Manu Patel back then, that really did drive the changes to the formula, Madam Secretary. A lot of people don't remember this evaluation, or most people around. And it was mainly focused on NMSU and UNM and CNM. But it's something worth sharing because it did drive a lot. The evaluation, the outcomes evaluation, a lot of it's in this formula. It really is. And then there's, of course, there's the Taoist, I call it the Taoist evaluation because it was presented by Mark and Michaela back in 2018 or 19, 17 or 18 maybe, but it's also another one on the formula that I think Shio might want to look at when it comes to data and information that could be helpful, that somewhat they're drivers of a lot of things that we're talking about today. And then just the other thing to keep in mind is that I think when it comes to the technical group is that there may be folks that, or even this group that were designated on it, but yeah, we do have a lot of expertise that we're willing to share and provide. I think Ricardo is really good with the branches and the 4 years. We have Didi Romero, who was part of the first process, that part of that formula process, along with Kathy and some other folks. So we're here in terms of you know, you need our support. I mean, anything you need from us, Madam Secretary, just let us know. So thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Hi, do you have a comment?
Yeah, just you know, Mark, and to build on kind of what you were saying was, I really do think that we're further down the road than we think we are. Well, I think we all kind of realize how far down the road we are, because we really do agree on. I had an opportunity to meet with Ricardo yesterday, I think it was, and he talked to me about the CUP's perspective on a lot of the funding formula, and I've had multiple conversations with Kathy and Mark, and I think we all agree on kind of, we identify what needs to be done with this funding formula to fix it. And I think we're kind of further down the road than we realize on this. So I think it's, in my opinion, I think that the technical committee, the reason why I ask about the technical committee is I think they're going to probably play a pretty vital role in this, because us, you know, we kind of are seeing at the 60,000 foot level what really is wrong here, and let's have the technical committee really kind of dive into how do we fix it. That's just my opinion on it.
Well, and they can put the numbers in to determine if it works.
Yeah, now, it's all fun and games until you put the numbers on there.
Hi, this actually drives really nice into the next person I would like to have contribute to the conversation. But I love that there's some consensus amongst the associations. Thank you for making our lives easier. But joining us is Director Abby. And I know that LFC has been actually the force bringing us together and forcing us to have these conversations. Me as a new secretary, as you know, I'm dealing with COVID. And I have to tell you, your students aren't making it easy on me right now with this Delta variant, but I'm working through it, okay? But Director Abby has also been here for a while and understands the funding formula, and so does our colleague Mark Valenzuela, who has briefed him a lot on these conversations. So Director Abby, I'd love to kind of hear your comments, what's working, what's not working, the challenges and potential solutions. And if you don't have solutions yet, that's okay. That's the purpose of this working group. And thank you for joining us. Director Abby?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm sorry I missed the first part of this meeting. I had a chance to make a medical appointment that I couldn't get out of. So, not cutting the base will help ameliorate a lot of discontent with the formula. I think we need to, when I think about the formula, in a way, I think less about the formula and more just about higher ed funding issues. I think we need to do more to incentivize outcomes for disadvantaged students. I think we're falling behind in completion, in attendance and completion for them. So that's really worrisome. And if there's any formula adjustment, that might be something to think about. We've talked a lot about wraparound services, and is that a formula issue or is that a funding issue in some other way? I don't know, but I just feel, the Georgia State model, that's something we need to address. I think compensation is front and center in what higher ed needs. We've fallen behind, and we rolled back the 4% in June of 2020. It rolled back for 21, and for 22 it's only 1.5%, and it looked great last fall, but right now it doesn't look that great. So, looking ahead, that's a very important issue I think we need to deal with. And then I really want to, this again isn't a formula issue because we are swimming in non-recurring revenue. We're going to hear more about this next week. And I think non-recurring revenue really provides an opportunity to really provide gains for colleges and universities outside the formula. And I have in mind, in particular, endowments. I think many institutions have a wide variety of initiatives they want to pursue. And seems to me it's easier for us to help them with incentivizing their fundraising activities so they can prioritize what they want to do rather than us send out a funding in one size fits all. So I really want to emphasize that as a funding opportunity for higher ed. Mark, what do we want to add? Oh yeah, actually President Shepard's talked to me about this too, and I was at NMSU the last couple of days. And when I think of the capital outlay hearings, many of the requests are really BR&R, building renewal and replacement. And we've fallen behind because funding has been lean. Institutions probably skimped on maintaining facilities. They have a raft of issues, from IT to the tunnels to the HVAC to the stucco to the roofs, and it just strikes me those aren't things that really ought to be coming all the way from the institution up to Santa Fe, up to the Board of Finance after an appropriation and back down to the institution. I think we should look for ways to try to fund those in some equitable way and then let institutions prioritize rather than deal with many of them through the capital outlay process. So Mark, do you want to add anything to, especially more oriented to the formula?
Sure. I'll just quickly say that I appreciate the conversation. I think what's heartwarming in the conversation is that we're looking at the right thing. So what I've heard from Shio is everything that we've already talked about here in New Mexico, and I think that all of us are focused on. So I think that's nice validation. So thank you, Madam Secretary. Thank you, David.
Thank you, Director Abby. Thank you, Mark. Some things I just want to kind of pull out from your comments Director Abby, wraparound services, how we fund that is a little disjointed. I know Mark Valenzuela can attest to that. We do some in RPSPs, and then we do a majority of it in the ING, and then how that's distributed to wraparound services. We know how that goes. Another thing is you were kind enough to give me the presentation you gave to CUP earlier this week, which also did have the Georgia State model, which I am reviewing. So thank you for that. Endowments. I agree with you. It's the easiest way to get money out the door and have institutions work to fundraise money to support that. So that's something that me and DFA are looking at. Now, I do have to, you guys have to excuse me. I'm a new secretary. I am basing this off of just things that I'm learning here and there, but capital. There is a portion or a percentage of the ING that's supposed to be technically pulled out from ING for you all to save towards maintenance and things of that. So I think that's something that we do need to address. Is it working? Are institutions pulling out that percentage? Are they not? Why not? Do we need to change that percentage? Do we need to fund it differently? I am throwing it out there. I know it's something that was brought up to me from some of the members of the Capital Outlay Committee, and it's something I'm throwing out there. I'm new, I'm learning, I'm willing to hear from you all, but that might have to be a side piece that we also address in this funding formula committee. All right, thank you, Director Abby. So with that, I want to be very respectful of time. We only have 20 minutes. I want to jump to Secretary Romero to see if she has any comments, and then we'll jump into principles and goals for our next meeting and discussion points. Secretary?
Good. Thank you, Secretary Rodriguez. And you know, it's really very eye-opening, you know, the conversations that are going on. I've been around a long time, and a lot of what I've dealt with has been capital outlay. And so, you know, Director Abby is much more familiar with the actual funding formula than I am. But the one thing I can tell you in dealing with all the institutions for 20 plus years is the fact that this is the first time that I've seen them come together and actually be on the same page. You know, I think LFC and DFA struggled for many, many years because we were getting hit from different perspectives on higher education. Everybody wanted something different, but I'm hopeful. I see that there's opportunities for us to be able to get to where we need to be. You know, you guys have made it easy for us because you have come together and you are, you know, on the same page with so many of these things. So I'm hopeful, and I'm looking forward to what comes out of this, because I really do see some major opportunities, which I had never seen in the past. So thank you all for all your hard work. Thank you for the collaboration. Thank you for what you're doing. And I'm really excited about this whole opportunity.
Thank you so much, Secretary Romero. I know you're extremely busy, and I appreciate you taking time to be with us today, and we'll follow up with your analyst, Nicole, with further conversations. All right, with that, I've been talking quite a bit, so I apologize, and I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to David and Dustin to lead the conversation for the next piece in the agenda, and we will adjourn at 12 o'clock. I want to be respectful of your time, especially on a Friday.
So clearly, these next two portions of the agenda, the goals and priorities, and then establishing action steps for different participants, are items that generally would take much more time than 20 minutes. We could potentially devote an entire meeting to this, but I think what may be a good strategy right now, Madam Secretary and Dustin, if you agree, is if we kind of use this portion as a listening session to get individuals' ideas in regards to what they see as 1, 2, or 3 critical priorities or goals, and we can all jot them down and return to them in later conversations to try to filter them into a number of actionable goals and priorities for the funding formula. Does that work for both of you? Madam Secretary?
Yes, it does. And I will note, David, that we may have 3 to 5, and then we can slowly determine what the 3 will be in our next meeting. But I just want to note that there's lots of ideas. There is lots of consensus, but it's a hard conversation, and we have to take it slow and steady in order to find some good outcomes for everyone. So, David, I'm fine with that. Are there folks that would like to touch on, some of the things that we have built consensus on that are very clear? Hi, Mark. I figured you'd be first, and I love it. Go ahead. Mark, go ahead and go first, and then we'll jump over to Ty.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. No, I think we've also just keeping it simple. And data if we can make data readily available, that'd be helpful. I think we all have associations where of course we have, the CUP has 7 presidents and chancellors. And so keeping them in the loop, I think keeping people informed also just makes it so much easier. And then that's, like you said, Madam Secretary, I really appreciate in terms of how you're approaching this, along with the LFC and the chair of LFC, Representative Lundstrom, is, not starting this, not building a whole new formula, right? And then also not having to have an overhaul done by the next legislative session. So I really do appreciate that approach. And then I think it's also great to see DFA and the secretary involved with this. Hi, Secretary Romero. Is, in the past, we've always been more LFC, HED, and the agencies, but having DFA and the Secretary Nicole and Cindy being involved with this, I think, like I said, whether it's the higher recommendation on the legislature, whether it's this formula, but having DFA, HED, and LFC on the same page makes a huge difference for all of us. So I just wanted to those are my comments. So thank you, Madam Secretary.
Thank you, Mark. From those comments, I got a principle, and that's keep information clear, make sure, or have clarity and simplicity when it comes to the formula, and real clear data parameters that are being inputted. All right, thank you. And thank you for those comments. All right, Ty, I'm going to jump over to you.
I've never used this hand thing before. Okay, there we go.
I know. I'm glad you finally learned how to use it.
I guess my comment and or question is, and it kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier, where as far as for this group and for this interim, we're coming into September, and kind of what are our expectations coming into this legislative session? What are we going to? I'm thinking that this group is kind of one of those, like I was saying, kind of the high level, identify what we need to do, and then have some more discussions so we can have some decisions that need to be made, and then have the technical group go out and do it and put the numbers to it and all that. So where are we, or what does the group feel as far as where are we going to go for this, going into this 30-day session, and what are we going to accomplish right now compared to, I know this is going to be a long-term kind of fix and kind of things that we need to get done, but I'm just kind of looking at direction as far as where we, realistically, what do we need? What do we want to get done? What do we need to get done for this legislative session, for this funding? And it doesn't even have to, well, actually, go ahead.
No, go ahead. I'm sorry. I cut you off.
That's all I have.
I would love for LFC to chime in, but it's been very clear to me from the chairwoman that we need to get the conversation going, and it's been late, and I apologize for that, and I'll take full ownership. But we need to see what's working, what's not working, and what small adjustments can be made to make it the most ideal formula for the state. From my understanding, it doesn't need to be ready and baked and cooked in the 30-day session, but conversations in a report does need to be delivered to our legislative leaders and the executive, at least preliminarily, and then we can go ahead and really dive into it after the session. But if I've misinterpreted that, Director Abby, Secretary Romero, please let me know. And then I'd also like to hear what associations think as well.
Go ahead. Or, well, if I can say, given the fact that typically HED has to give a funding recommendation to DFA for higher ed in November, we do got a couple of months on things, but I'm thinking, given the short term, identify, like, for example, we all agree on no redistribution. That needs to go away. Maybe, identify maybe that, and then maybe one or two other short-term things for this legislative session that HED can submit to DFA, and then look at the long-term goals. And we had the Route 66 goals that were established a couple years back. Those types of things that we can do long-term. But I'm just,
So good point. Establish short-term goals that we can get done in the next couple of months.
Right.
And then have the long-term goals established that we start after the session and start talking about after the session. Got it. Director Abby, your hand's up.
I proposed, I guess, 2 short-term goals, and I mentioned at risk already. I'm not sure we can do better than using Pell as the surrogate to fund at risk, but I just think it could be weighted higher. So I would challenge the technical group to take that issue up if others in this policy group agree. And second, I think I heard Kathy Ulibarri talk about the importance of incentivizing collaboration. And Mark Valenzuela reminds me, it kind of relates to incentivizing transfers from the 2 years to the 4 years and maybe sharing revenue. I don't know, but we want more of that. Probably a decade ago, Bill Taylor, who was at Highlands at that time as the dean of the business school, worked on a plan to, within the existing formula, make degrees that were produced collaboratively worth more in generating a share of the pie. And I somehow or other, I think that's if the technical group could bring forward a solution on that in the short run, I'd like to see that. Those two things.
Thank you, Director Abby. I did write those down, and definitely something we can bring forward to the technical group. Kathy?
Yes, thank you, Madam Secretary. To Director Abby's point on the at-risk, I do think we have data readily available on race and ethnicity of our students. And so embedding something about underrepresented students into the, I think the technical group could come up with something pretty quickly there too.
And then just a comment I want to make at risk is we also have to see what existing data points that we collect from our institutions and the agency to see if we can clearly define that and also have the data to back it up. And so let's figure out that definition probably first, and we can do that in coordination with the associations and consult LFC, and then we can start having the technical group evaluate what data is available now, and if it's not available now, what do we need to collect to get to that definition? I think I'm kind of, Mark, go ahead.
No, and I just want to reemphasize the definitions are so critical, right? In terms of all of us understanding the playing field. And so I really appreciate you pointing that out, whether it's at risk, even collaboration, what does that mean in terms of collaboration, right? So I think definitely making sure we all are on the same page on definitions. So thank you for saying that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Yeah, we'll definitely run some definitions around with one another on this. Some other things that I don't think we can get accomplished now, but I do want to put it on folks' radar. I do think we need to have a conversation on dual credit. I've been doing a lot of education type conversations with the executive. I've been pulling a lot of data from my team to really understand it and what we need to fund it adequately, and how we can also have institutions help with that, though, to a certain degree. So that may be a long-term fix or a long-term goal that we put in the books. Another is we mentioned talking about research, and I know that the 2 other associations, not directly research institutions, did say they support that conversation. So maybe that's a long-term goal as well. As far as the transfer issue, or collaboration, which should encompass transfer, we're gonna have to look at momentum points. And how we use momentum points, is that the way we want to move forward? Are there other ways we can collect transfer data? So that's a conversation we need to have. Mark Chisholm is an expert and probably hitting his head going, what are you saying, Secretary? But he'll clarify everything that I'm saying right now with the accurate information. Anything else? All right. I think what I'm going to do is there's several things that I need to do. And the first of which is sending you the presentations and the data information that Shio graciously offered to share with the group as well. I will have that in your inbox by today or Monday. And then also, we will also work on a draft of the meeting agenda for next time so we can all review and contribute to it. We also need to figure out what types of terms that we need to do definitions for, and then the short-term and long-term goals in a list that we can all contribute to and make sure that we agree on and we're on the same page. Did I miss anything, David, Dustin, or anyone else? You all are lucky I went to school for facilitation. I will say that.
Yeah, you're definitely providing a nice model for us, so we appreciate that. No, I think you hit the high points for sure.
All right. Thank you, association directors. Thank you, presidents. Thank you, Director Abby. Thank you, Secretary Romero. And thank you, Shio. I know we're all busy, but I appreciate you taking time to be with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.